Hi, this first lecture really is a lot of definitions as we go through how biology is organized at the different levels in which we study biology, and also what makes an organism living. So biology is the study of life, with bios meaning life and logos meaning study. I also want to add really quickly that this lecture is unique in that these PowerPoint slides have a lot of text. I apologize for that. I don't have a whiteboard right now, and I want you to see all of these key terms. I normally wouldn't have this much text on any of my PowerPoint slides. Please don't just read the slides, but please watch the videos because I will be giving you some additional information that isn't written on the slides. Okay, so here we go. What makes something living? As we look at this virus, this happens to be the COVID-19 virus, it's important to realize that viruses are non-living. The reasons they're non-living are they don't have any of the characteristics that make something living. So I'm going to go through the characteristics of living organisms with you, and there are going to be some sub-definitions under each of these categories too. So the first thing that makes something living is that all living organisms are composed of cells, and those cells came from other cells. So as cells divide, they can either divide into two new organisms, or through sexual reproduction, two cells can come together to form what's called a zygote, and that zygote can divide many, many, many times to make an entire organism. All living organisms are either unicellular, meaning that entire organism is just one cell, or multicellular, meaning that organism is composed of many different types of cells, each of which has a unique type of function. Cells in multicellular organisms are highly specialized to perform these specific functions. If you look at the list of organisms under each category, you see that unicellular organisms includes the bacteria, the archaea, and the protists. There's also one type of fungi, the yeast, which are unicellular, but most other fungi are all multicellular. So under multicellular, sorry, that's a tongue twister, it includes plants, animals, and fungi. We are going to talk about all of these organisms throughout this semester in a lot more detail. And in particular, we're going to talk a lot about animal cells in this class. So this is an example of a unicellular organism versus a multicellular organism. On the left is a paramecium, which is a protist. So a lot of complexity in that organism, even though it's only one cell. It actually can engulf its prey and has complex digestion, a lot of metabolism happening in that simple little single-celled organism, versus that frog who is obviously multicellular. Living organisms reproduce, and those two types of reproduction are either asexual or sexual. So asexual reproduction is when an organism just simply copies its DNA and then splits in half and makes two new organisms that are identical to each other. That's how bacteria reproduce. There are also many other organisms that we'll talk about this semester that reproduce asexually. Sexual reproduction means that male and female gametes come together and form that zygote, that first cell, and that cell divides a lot of times to make a new organism. But all living organisms have to have some type of reproduction. Now, having said that, viruses reproduce also, but they don't meet all of these other key factors that make something living. Okay, so this is just an example of asexual versus sexual reproduction. You can see the cell on the left is an amoeba, and it is basically making two identical copies of itself called daughter cells versus the frog. So I used a protist and a frog again. Obviously, the frog reproduction is really living organisms grow and develop. Okay, viruses do not do this. Single-celled organisms really just simply grow in size, whereas multicellular organisms really have a lot of different stages of development, and their development is often very complex. Again, looking at this frog example, we all know from tadpole to adult frog, that's quite a transformation that happens. So multicellular organisms tend to grow and develop in much more complex ways than just a single cell that simply gets bigger. Living organisms must obtain and use energy. We will spend a couple of lectures this semester talking about how living organisms obtain and use energy through photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So some organisms carry out both processes, such as plants, and then other organisms simply just do cell respiration. And we'll talk about that in a lot of detail this semester. This term metabolism is a very important term in biology. An organism's metabolism is the sum of all chemical reactions happening in that organism. A lot of people misuse this term and they say, oh, I have a slow metabolism or I have a really fast metabolism. What they're talking about is actually metabolic rate. Your metabolic rate is how you burn calories. Your metabolism is something completely different. So that's the true definition of metabolism. Living organisms respond to stimuli. So you could poke a virus and it's not going to react. It's not going to respond in any way. But we know that we get poked with a needle, we definitely respond. So there are two different kinds of stimuli that we respond to. One type comes from within us, so internal stimuli such as our blood glucose level, and we'll talk about how we maintain that at a constant level. And also we respond to external stimuli such as light, touch, sound, heat, sight, smell. All of our senses are used to respond to outside stimuli. Homeostasis. This is a very important concept. And all living organisms have mechanisms to maintain homeostasis. So the word homeo means same, stasis means state. So it's keeping things at the same state. You can think about your body temperature is a really great example of homeostasis. You can go out in the snow or you can go out on a hot day and your body temperature stays roughly around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, 37 degrees Celsius. So we have a lot of different mechanisms in the body that keep factors at relatively similar states. So that is a very important topic in biology. And in fact, you'll spend a lot of time talking about this if you go on to take human physiology at some point. DNA is the genetic code for all living organisms. Viruses do have DNA, but many viruses have RNA as their genetic code. That is very unique to viruses. No living organisms have RNA as their genetic code. We have RNA, but we make our RNA from our DNA. DNA is the recipe for how to make every single protein in your body. And this is a unique trait of living organisms. Okay, and lastly, populations of organisms evolve and adapt. In lecture number 2, I'm going to talk about evolution. Evolution, unfortunately, is one of the most misunderstood terms in all of biology. I'll just go ahead and tell you right now, evolution does not mean that monkeys became humans. Evolution is something completely different that we will talk about in a lot more detail in lecture number 2. But first, it's important to understand that individuals do not evolve, populations evolve. I'm going to define population later in this lecture as we talk about how biology is organized. But changes in a gene pool over time happen at the population level, and that is the level at which evolution occurs. And this is a trait that is unique to living organisms. This adaptation and evolution of living organisms is one of the characteristics of life. So here's our list of the characteristics of life. Oh, look how homeostasis got cut off there. How did that happen? Sorry about that. I will fix that before I post the slides, but homeostasis is all one word. Not sure how that happened. Okay, now let's quickly talk about how biology is organized. And in this class, we are going to start at the most basic level of study in biology. And that is, we are going to look at subatomic particles. And I know that when you hear subatomic particles, you usually think of a chemistry or a physics class, but you're going to see how these subatomic particles play a major role in which atoms are going to bond with other atoms to form molecules, which create life. So subatomic particles are very important to understand. And in particular, those electrons are going to play a major role. So I've listed 3 subatomic particles here. There are more than 3 that we now know about. But in this class, we only talk about 3. We talk about protons, neutrons, and electrons. And there is an entire lecture video on subatomic particles that will happen, I believe, lecture number 2 or 3. So anyway, there's one coming up that focuses just on subatomic particles. We do spend, again, a lot of time on that because it's incredibly important to your understanding of biology, believe it or not. But don't be afraid, it's very basic level that we cover chemistry in this class. The next level above subatomic particle is actually the atom. So if we broke down an atom to anything smaller than an atom, it would be subatomic particles. But the entire atom together is the smallest unit of matter that still retains all the physical properties of that element. So the example I've given here is 1 atom of gold is the smallest piece of gold that would still have the exact same boiling point, melting point, density. Every characteristic of gold would still be in that 1 atom. Anything smaller than that, and we would be looking at subatomic particles. So subatomic particles come together to make the atom. 2 or more atoms together make a molecule. And we are going to be talking about molecules quite a bit in this class, especially what we call the macromolecules, which are the big molecules that make up living organisms. And you can see examples of molecules here in various ways that they can be shown. Above molecules is something that's definitely more complex than a bunch of molecules coming together. These are called the cell organelles. Organelle means tiny organs, and these are the tiny organs that make up a cell. You're going to learn all of the different functions of those organelles. And if you've ever taken a general biology class before, I'm sure that you've heard many of these names, things like endoplasmic reticulum, lysosomes, Golgi. So we're going to learn in detail what those organelles do within the cell. So cell is the next level. And we're going to talk about 2 major cell types this semester, eukaryotic cells and prokaryotic cells. And we'll talk about which organisms fall within each of those categories and the major differences between those 2. So the word eukaryotic, EU, that prefix EU means true. And karyote technically means kernel, but it's referring to the nucleus of the cell. So eukaryote technically means true nucleus, whereas prokaryote, pro means before, so prokaryote means before nucleus. So the prokaryotes are the bacteria and the archaea, and they do not have a nucleus. What that means, they still have DNA, you can see in this diagram, pointing to the DNA in the cell. But the difference is the eukaryotic cell has that DNA protected in what we call the nuclear envelope, protected from the chemistry of the cell. That master copy for how to make every single protein in the body is protected in a nucleus in a eukaryotic cell. But in prokaryotic cells, those organisms just have that DNA free in the cytoplasm of the cell, constantly being exposed to that chemistry, higher rates of mutation in their DNA. So bacteria have a higher rate of DNA mutation for this reason, also because they replicate so quickly. But we'll talk about that in more detail throughout the semester. So it's important to realize 2 major categories of cell, and the biggest difference between those is whether they have a nucleus or not. So eukaryotic cells do have a nucleus. Prokaryote means before nucleus, and they do not have DNA enclosed in a nucleus. They have DNA, it's just not enclosed in a nucleus. So no nucleus in prokaryotes. Tissues are a group of cells working together to perform the same functions. And in a face-to-face bio class, you often look at these tissue types under the microscope. If you go on to take anatomy, you will look at these in detail. You can see this is a tissue type called simple cuboidal epithelium, and these are kidney tubules. And you can see all of these cells lining this tubule. They're working together to perform a similar function. They're secreting mucus, or they're providing some type of surface for a fluid to flow with reduced friction. lots of different functions of these epithelial cells, but the key is that it's a group of cells working together to perform the same function, and that's called a tissue. You get a bunch of different tissues together working to perform similar functions, then you have an actual organ. So here I'm showing you a kidney. That kidney relies on many different tissue types to perform the functions of the kidney. So this would be just the tubules, but to make that whole kidney, we need a lot of different tissue types. And then if you get a bunch of organs together performing similar functions, that's called an organ system. So that kidney is part of what we call the excretory system, and you can see that excretory system consists of several organs working together. You can think of your digestive system, your cardiovascular system. We have a lot of different organ systems where there are organs working together to perform similar functions, really to accomplish the same goal. And then we have a whole organism. Quick to add title. That doesn't look so good, does it? I'll fix that too before I post these slides. But an organism obviously is an entire entity composed of cells. That's what makes it living. And we usually refer to organisms by their species name. So a species is the most specific level of biological taxonomy. And these are organisms that can not only mate, but they can produce fertile offspring, meaning their babies can have babies. So the classic example, a mule is a separate species, and it is made by a horse and a donkey having a baby. So horses, obviously, we know are reproductive. They can breed with each other and produce fertile offspring. Otherwise, we wouldn't have any more horses. Same for donkeys, that if a horse and a donkey have a baby, their baby is a mule. And believe it or not, mules cannot reproduce. They cannot produce fertile offspring. In fact, they can't even reproduce with each other at all. So I think I just mistakenly a minute ago said a mule is a species. Mule is not a separate species. So a mule is what's called a hybrid that exists when a horse and a donkey have a baby. Sorry, I kind of messed up that story. So horse is one species, donkey is another species. They have a baby. It's a mule, but horse and donkey are two separate species because they can't produce a fertile baby. Okay, I finally said that right. Okay, a population. A population is a very, very important term to understand in biology, and we will talk about populations in the evolution lecture. A population is a group of individuals of the same species, okay, so meaning they can reproduce and they can produce fertile offspring. And to be a population, you have to be living in the same place at the same time. In other words, you're all interacting with each other, you're competing for resources, you're competing for mates. A lot of different factors in populations that affect the organisms in that group. But again, this is the level at which evolution occurs. So we will be talking about populations again. And then if you get all the populations of living organisms together, they form what's called the community. So the community would be all of the bacteria, the lichens, the fungi, all of the protists, all of the insects, the plants, all the other complex mammals and birds, worms, all of the organisms living together, affecting each other. Again, competing for resources, but really relying on each other as part of the food web, and other important factors that really are studied a lot by community ecologists. So the community is a very important level of study in biology. If you combine that community, which is the living organisms, with all of the non-living factors that affect them, that's what's called an ecosystem. And ecosystems are really important to study in biology, especially as we cause more and more damage to our Earth. Understanding the dynamics of not only living organisms interacting with each other, but all of these non-living factors that affect them. So we divide those two factors into what we call biotic, which means living, and abiotic. That prefix a means without, so that would mean without life, really, if you broke it down. But those are the non-living components. So things such as fire, solar radiation, rainfall, soil nutrients, shelter, These are all non-living factors that affect living organisms. So the ecosystem is both of those together. It's the combination of the biotic and the abiotic. And then finally, if you look at the biggest level we can possibly study biology, it's what we call the biosphere. So the biosphere is really looking at things like global warming, global climate change. These are the big issues that combine everything on Earth, the atmosphere, the land, the water, air quality. So going all the way from subatomic particles up to the biosphere. These are all levels at which we can study biology. In a general biology class, you really study all of these. In something more specific, like Bio 102, you really only go to probably the organ or organ system level. That's really the highest level we go, except for talking about populations when we talk about evolution. So that's it for this lecture. Thanks.